Yeah, so this is a discussion on why capitalism needs war. But I think in order to fully appreciate the situation, we need to go back quite a bit in history, to the Dark Ages, actually. I'm referring, of course, to the 1990s. Yeah, 1990 was only 35 years ago, but it's hard to understate just how different the world has become in this time. The USSR collapsed in 1991. And at this time, the capitalist class was euphoric. Capitalism was the dominant system basically everywhere in the world. George Bush Sr. declared a new world order. And this was supposed to be a period of unending prosperity, peace, and stability. And Francis Fukuyama even declared the end of history. Now, looking back on these words now, they sound like a cruel joke. Instead of prosperity and international cooperation, we have poverty and misery and war in one region of the world after another. In Ukraine, it's been an open war with Russia since February of 2022, where hundreds of thousands of people have been killed and millions have been displaced. One of the most underreported conflicts is the civil war in Sudan, which has caused the world's most devastating humanitarian crisis. More than 12 million people have been forcibly displaced. 25 million are facing acute hunger, and 600,000 are on the brink of famine. And nearly every major power in the world is involved in these events to some degree or another, some of them actually cynically supporting both sides in the conflict in order to further their own interests at the expense of the Sudanese people. You also have rising tensions between the US and China over Taiwan and the South China Sea and the region around it, mainly for control of the vital shipping routes in the region. But above all, you have the genocide perpetrated by Israel in Gaza. For the past 22 months, Netanyahu and the IDF have inflicted a campaign of indiscriminate terror, murder, and starvation on the Palestinian people. And unable to destroy this insurgency, they've carried out atrocity after atrocity, aiming at the total annihilation of Gaza and the forced expulsion of Palestinians. And the crimes are beyond description. And Gaza is only one front in this murderous rampage. It's also carried out mass assassinations in Lebanon. It's bombed Iran's nuclear facilities and is fueling sectarian barbarism in Syria, leading to the deaths of many more civilians. And all of these wars, but especially the genocide in Gaza, have caused mass anger amongst millions of people everywhere. The flood of images of Israel's genocide, captured by the few remaining journalists in Gaza who haven't been murdered, images of famished children, all skin and bones, crowds of aid seekers machine gunned by US mercenaries. All of this is turning public opinion worldwide against the so-called only democracy in the Middle East. And former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett has warned that Israel's reputation is in collapse in the United States. And it's the same in Canada. There was a recent poll from Angus Reid that showed that more than 2/3 of Canadians consider the humanitarian crisis in Gaza to be a moral outrage. More than half consider that Israel's actions in Gaza constitute a genocide. And similar figures could be cited for practically every country around the world. In country after country, you've had mass demonstrations in support of the Palestinian people. You had the magnificent encampment movement that on the campuses across North America and Europe. And yet, nothing has changed. Despite this upsurge of public outrage, the world seems to be barreling towards violence and destruction. So why is this? Well, the ideologists of capitalism love to say, well, war is just a part of human nature, and that people are motivated by religion or racism or hatred. And perhaps I think the most infamous theory of war is developed by a man called Samuel Huntington. This is the so-called clash of civilizations. And he came up with these ideas in the early 90s, arguing that after the collapse of the USSR, the world would more and more break up into these power blocks based on culture. So, the Christian West and the Islamic world and so on and so forth. And that because we all have this evolutionary drive to fight those who don't look like ourselves, like this is the main cause of war. And this is one of the dominant ideas that the ruling class puts forward to this day. I think this argument is pretty easy to break down, because if that's true, then why are all of the Western governments going to war while the vast majority of their populations oppose these wars? The explanation actually explains nothing. It's not an accident that these racist ideas were popularized right as US imperialism was preparing to go to war in Iraq. What this actually is a thin cover to justify the dominance of US imperialism. So yeah, if we want to end these wars, we first have to understand what gives rise to them. The military theoretician, Karl Clausewitz, once famously said, "War is the continuation of politics by other means." And Lenin, the leader of the Russian Revolution, took this a step further and said that politics is simply concentrated economics. So what does he mean by this? Well, what he means is that the nature of war is ultimately determined by the economic structure of the society that wages it. And at the height of the First World War, Lenin wrote this excellent book called Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. I believe we have some copies of it at the literature table. And I think, in my opinion, if you want to understand the world today, you absolutely must read this book. It's over 100 years old. But to be honest, you will learn more reading this than you will learn from any other book that's been published on the subject since. In fact, the period that we're living in actually has many similarities to the period that Lenin was writing about just before and during World War I. And what Lenin explained was that the fundamental characteristic of modern society is that the economy is dominated by monopolies. If you listen to the defenders of capitalism, they'll try to tell you that capitalism is all about free markets and free competition and all of this kind of nonsense. And there's this old washed-up politician. I was finding some quotes from him. You might remember him. His name was Justin Trudeau. His favorite phrase was, "We fight for the middle class and those working hard to join it." I think this is absolutely ridiculous. The middle class isn't growing. The reality is that the middle class has been totally obliterated. 100 years ago, a significant portion of society was actually small business owners, but more and more they've been swallowed up by massive monopoly corporations that are able to outcompete them. And most of these people, former small business owners, have been thrown into the ranks of the working class. And this is part of the logic of the system. Karl Marx and Engels anticipated this all the way back in 1848 when they first wrote the Communist Manifesto. They explained that capitalism is a system based on competition, but because the winners can expand their operations and therefore produce more stuff for cheaper, well, then they're in an even better position to outcompete their rivals. And this process goes on until you have basically only a handful of massive enterprises that dominate the whole of society. So this is part of the logic of the system. And I think it's self-evident in my opinion, but in case there's anybody here who might not be convinced, I have some stats to prove it. In Canada, 5 banks dominate the finance sector. A handful of companies control the mining industry. 4 telecom giants have monopolized communications. 3 oil corporations control all oil and gas, and 3 corporations control the media. Here's one from the Forbes Global 2000. This is an annual ranking of the largest publicly listed companies in the world. In 2024, these 2,000 companies generated $52 trillion in US revenues. They own $238 trillion in assets, which is equivalent to more than 52% of the total wealth on the planet. And this isn't even enough to show the full extent of the concentration, because all of these companies then own majority shares in other companies, and those companies own shares in other companies, and so on and so forth in like this big capitalist pyramid. And in this way, they become part of a whole monopolist network dominated by a small group of very large enterprises. And a few years ago, there was a group of Swiss academics who studied this question in depth. They put together a database of 37 million companies around the world, and they basically tracked everything that they could find about these companies. Where each company's income comes from, who holds shares in what, things like this. And basically, through this, they mapped out the entire world economy. And they came to the conclusion that just 147 companies control 40% of the total wealth on the planet. And 737 companies control fully 80% of the global economy. So this is the situation that we're living in today. And yeah, at the top of this pyramid is the banks. Actually, 5 out of the 10 top companies on the Forbes 2000 are banks. Now, the banks were originally just middlemen that helped to make paying for things easier. But over time, they've accumulated so much wealth that they're now in a position to dominate the whole economy. Most companies today, even the very large ones, can't operate without taking on massive loans from the big banks. And this means that basically nothing substantial can get produced in society without the bankers giving it the okay. And this fusion of industry and banks led to the creation of what Lenin called finance capital. And this finance capital completely dominates society. It dominates the whole economy, but it also dominates the state. Now, it's a well-known fact that billionaires hate taxes. And one reason for this is that it's far more convenient for them to loan their money to the government so that they can make a nice return on their investment later on. But also, he who pays the piper chooses the tune. So this arrangement suits them very well because that means that they can withdraw their money from the government if they deem it to not be acting in their interests. And this is a very useful protection against any socialist government, for example, that they would consider to be too left-wing or who tries to carry out any reforms that would limit their profits. Also, the state is staffed with reliable agents that come directly from private industry. And sometimes it goes the opposite way. Politicians that have done a good job acting as basically lapdogs for the imperialists are then rewarded with lucrative positions in private industry. So for example, after leaving politics, Bill Morneau, the former finance minister, took up a very comfortable position on the board of directors of CIBC. Frank McKenna, who was the former premier of New Brunswick, is now chair of Brookfield Corporation and the deputy chairman of TD Bank. And today we have an even more obvious example. Usually you have to go and look these things up, but today we have a prime minister, Mark Carney, who is quite literally a banker. So yeah, I think in a system like this, any talk of democracy is a joke, to be honest. The government maintains democratic forms in order to try to dupe working class people. But in reality, the state is actually a vehicle for the defense of the interests of finance capital. So basically, what we have in the main, in all of the capitalist countries, is a giant machine that's been created by the elite that they use to dominate all of society. And of course, their main aim is to enrich themselves, to generate ever greater profits. But there's a problem, because under capitalism, the source of profit is actually the working class. In order for the capitalists to make a profit, it's necessary that the workers are not paid the full value of what they produce. And this means that the wages of the workers are then too low to be able to afford to buy back all of the products that they themselves are producing. And this is a major problem for the capitalists, because after all, how can you make a profit if you can't sell the stuff that you're making? And this is the thing that constantly forces the capitalists to seek out new markets, export the commodities that they can't sell at home. And this is at the center of what is behind this vicious nature of capitalism to expand at all costs. Right? This is behind the reason for the colonization of Americas by Britain and France and Spain and Portugal in the 17th and 18th centuries. The European powers needed new markets, new sources of raw materials, and they were prepared to exterminate hundreds of millions of indigenous people to make this a reality. In the late 19th century, there was the so-called scramble for Africa, where the whole continent was divided up into the colonial possessions of one or another of the European powers. In fact, it wasn't just Africa, actually. It was the whole of the world, right? It was subjected to this from Asia all the way to Latin America. And by Lenin's time, when Lenin was writing in 1916 was when he published Imperialism. By this time, the imperialists had completely divided up the world amongst themselves. Now, obviously, in the last 100 years, things have changed. The powers have changed, but the basic situation remains the same. You have a small number of very rich imperialist nations that suck all of the wealth out of the poorer countries. According to one Oxfam report, countries in the global north control 69% of global wealth, despite making up just 21% of the population. And Canada is part of this Western imperialist alliance, and Canada benefits from this mass transfer of wealth. Oxfam actually reported in Canada, the richest 1% were paid $7.2 million per day from the global south through the financial system in 2023. And obviously, this is just the banking system. I mean, this is part of the entire system as a whole. I've heard this joke going around online. People like to say that Canada is just 3 mining corporations in a trench coat. That's actually not very far from the truth, to be honest. In fact, 75% of global mining companies are headquartered in Canada. And together they control $330 billion worth of mining assets, and 2/3 of those are not in Canada. So this is imperialism. Finance capital uses its dominance of the state, the diplomatic and the military strength of the state, to secure markets and resources and cheap labor in other countries. And this constant search for sources of profit abroad is the real source of war. What imperialist war really is, it's a fight between different gangs of robbers for a bigger share of the loot. The loot, of course, being the products that have been created by the working class. But the logic of all of this is precisely what makes war an inevitability under the capitalist system. Now, the First World War was the first major inter-imperialist conflict. And of course, each power justified their entry into the war with these very lofty abstractions like defense of the fatherland or the right of nations to self-determination. And I have to also say that at the time, the left parties, the social democratic parties, were only too happy to back the capitalists in their own countries. So in Austria, the social democrats echoed the anti-Russian and anti-Serb propaganda of the war party in Vienna. The opportunist wing of the Russian social democracy spoke about the threat of reactionary German imperialism and the need to come to the aid of oppressed Serbia. And all of these so-called workers' leaders eagerly rushed to support their own capitalists and voted to send millions of workers to their deaths. There was only actually a handful of socialist parties, a handful of socialists really in Europe that did their duty and opposed the war consistently. Lenin actually wrote about this. He had a quote that I like quite a bit. He said, imperialist war is like, imagine if you have one slaveholder owning 200 slaves, and you have a second slaveholder owning 100 slaves, and the second one goes to war with the first one for a more just redivision of the slaves. This is precisely the real nature of imperialist war. It has nothing to do with these high-minded, lofty ideals of things like self-determination. This is about profit and division of the spoils. And this is why Lenin and the Bolsheviks went to such great lengths to study and to expose the real nature of the war. At the time, British imperialism was the dominant power. At its height, the British Empire covered a quarter of the Earth's surface. They controlled a similar percentage of world GDP, and they had almost exclusive control over all of the world's main shipping routes. But other imperialist powers like Germany were developing and needed access to their own colonies and their own markets. So yeah, World War I had nothing to do with self-determination. It was about breaking the domination of British imperialism and securing a redivision of the global power, obviously in favor of Germany. This was their aim. And this is the same reason why the imperialists fight wars today. So yeah, at this point, it might be reasonable for somebody to ask, okay, so Lenin says imperialism inevitably leads to war. But does it really have to be inevitable? Because after all, after World War II, things seem to be, stabilizing. They weren't perfect, but at least they seem to be kind of going in the right direction. So can't we just go back to this somehow? Maybe we just need smarter leaders with better policies. Obviously, I think this is a good question. I think the thing to understand is that the historical period that we are coming out of, the period between 1945 and roughly, the present or maybe a few years ago, this was a very strange period historically. Before 1945, there was always many, great powers that were fighting for world dominance, and it was these struggles that that were the ultimate causes of these wars. But because of the way in which World War II unfolded, and on the basis of this massive post-war boom that followed it, the USA emerged massively strengthened, while all of the other imperialist powers were basically crushed. And this was reinforced by the collapse of the USSR in the 1990s and the restoration of capitalism in China. And this was the situation that was behind the so-called post-war order. The boom, turned into this massive upswing, created the conditions where capitalism in the United States was able to temporarily overcome its own limitations, and they became the organizers of world capitalism. They began to, dictate world policy. They forced, protectionist barriers. They forced free trade open, and they set up all of these institutions of world finance, the United Nations, the World Bank, this sort of thing, that created a certain amount of cohesion in the world economy. And yeah, the US was the only major imperialist power, and it was able to impose its will on the planet basically everywhere, single-handedly. And this meant that new world wars were ruled out. Obviously, this didn't mean that there was no war, but they became reduced to small wars where only a few million people at most were put to the slaughter. But yeah, part of the reason why there was less war was because the US was able to impose their will without the use of direct military force. They preferred instead to mainly sponsor or lead coups in dozens of countries to eliminate their enemies and install friendly regimes. And most of the wars that did happen were also initiated by the US imperialists, I have to add. They did quite a bit of that themselves. Yeah, but at the time, there was actually many on the left, and even some who called themselves Marxists, that actually celebrated this. They came up with all of these kind of theories that said, oh yes, capitalism had somehow managed to overcome its contradictions, and maybe through arms expenditure or things like this, it was going to avoid booms and slumps, and eventually, thanks to all this kind of globalization, we would have a world free from war altogether. That does not sound very nice. I think this was misguided at best. I think for some of these people, perhaps the real motivation was that they were no longer interested in participating in class struggle or fighting for workers. So they came up with these very nice new theories to soothe their consciousness and justify abandoning the struggle. But yeah, this was wrong. The fundamental contradiction of capitalism is this. The workers, who are the source of profits, are not paid the full value of what they produce. And sooner or later, this means that the capitalists cannot sell their goods and thus can't continue to make profits. And yeah, the capitalists have certain ways to get around this. Debt and credit is one. Exporting capital and commodities to the imperialist-dominated countries is obviously another. But all of these solutions just end up exacerbating the problem in the long run. So that even the richest country on earth eventually ends up in crisis, right? Because this is an iron law of capitalism. In reality, the US economy, despite what the stock markets might have you believe, the real US economy has been in decline for some time. In 1985, the United States actually represented 36% of world GDP. In 2024, it was down to only 26%. And in the same period, China has grown from just 2.5% of world GDP to 18.5%. So yeah, one thing I want to emphasize with respect to the US, this is a relative decline. The US is still the biggest and also obviously the most reactionary imperialist power on the planet. It spends more on defense than the next 9 countries combined. But the fact is that US imperialism's ability to totally dominate the world has been slowly eroded over the past 35 years to the point where a totally new situation is emerging. Also, not all of the leaders of US imperialism have realized this. Actually, they became used to this kind of total power. They became colossally arrogant. But in recent years, they've actually failed in all of their major war aims. There was the embarrassing retreat in Afghanistan. There's huge amounts of debt in the economy, and big resentment within the layers of US workers against any kind of new war effort. And this is one of the reasons why the Ukraine war, for example, was a massive miscalculation from the point of view of Washington. And the only consequence that this has had is that a whole group of powers that were once aligned with the United States have now aligned themselves with Russia, actually. So what this shows is that even the most powerful of the imperialist powers has its limitations. So what's happening is that there's a realignment in the balance of power in the world. This is what's taking place. And US imperialism, it's still the strongest power. It's still the most reactionary force on the planet. But this relative weakening has given rise to new rising imperialist powers that have more room to maneuver. So on the one hand, you have obviously the economic powerhouse of China, but also Russia, on the other hand, are challenging the dominance of the US and the Western bloc on the world stage. And this is, this is having serious consequences at home for the Canadian ruling class. Obviously, Canada is itself an imperialist power, but it's benefited for a long time from being the junior partner of US imperialism. And now it's losing out in these struggles. Just to give one example, multiple countries in West Africa have kicked out France, and they've moved closer to Russia. And as a result, the Canadian mining companies that have interests in the region are losing out. So the government of Mali, for example, which recently aligned with Russia, has seized a mine from the Canadian mining giant Barrick Gold. And similarly, Burkina Faso has nationalized 2 formerly Canadian-owned mines. So yeah, the days where Canadian companies could safely profit under the backing of the Western imperialism are gone. Right? This is a completely different situation. The post-war period has ended, and with it, this era of peace and relative stability. And now you have a situation where competing capitalist powers are challenging each other for world domination. And this is what makes it similar to that period that Lenin lived in and wrote about before World War I. This is actually capitalism's normal state, right? The post-war order and that period of relative peace, this was an aberration, right? If you look far back enough in history, in capitalist history, you'll see that the period that we're living through right now is actually average for capitalism, I guess. Yeah, so obviously the ruling class tries to avoid wars wherever possible, but the truth is, this is the logic of capitalism. There isn't actually any other way for capitalism to operate than this. They've spent decades of talking about, the value of life, national sovereignty, right to self-determination. But now the imperialists are showing what their real face is. The mask has fallen off, and now they're fighting over the world like wolves over a carcass. And the policy of each country is ultimately dictated by their desire to protect their interests of their own bourgeoisie. Yeah, one thing is some people have argued that faced with unbridled US power, the idea of a multipolar world where you have multiple imperialist powers vying for dominance is somehow a progressive thing. Because this will allow certain oppressed countries a greater degree of sovereignty or something like this, and that somehow this is an ideal that we should fight for. But I think now, seeing the rise of wars on the world stage like we're seeing today, this is the reality of what a multipolar world looks like. This is basically giant bullies on the playground. Maybe it was before you'd have one bully on the playground that would kind of beat the shit out of everybody. Now you have 3 bullies on the playground, right? And maybe, okay, I get it, I'm a little sympathetic because you want to see the bully that bullied you get kicked in the teeth. Okay, so fair enough. But is this going to actually change the situation for working class people? No. The reality is that things are going to get much worse. What this is going to mean for ordinary people is chaos and destruction in one region of the world after another. But it's also going to mean increasing misery and poverty for working class people at home as the ruling powers are driven to increase military spending. So for example, Germany is increasing military spending from 92 billion euros to 162 billion euros, which equals a total of $649 billion over the next 5 years. And obviously things are no different in Canada. This is, Canada, the so-called peacekeeping country. Obviously this is a myth. Canada is actually the 15th largest spender on military in the world. And now Carney is planning to increase that spending to 5% of GDP, which equates to a rise from $41 billion per year to $150 billion per year. And just to put this in context, the total amount of federal funding that was spent on healthcare in 2024 was only $52 billion. So yeah, all of these spending increases are going to have to come from somewhere. And I think one thing we know for sure is that they're not going to come from the pockets of the rich. They're going to try to make workers, and they're going to try to make poor people pay for the crisis. And if these spending increases are actually going to become a reality, it means deep cuts to healthcare, deep cuts to social services, education, all of the things that ordinary people have come to rely on. And on the other hand, well, for the capitalists, all of this warmongering means, obscene profits, right? The so-called defense industry. In reality, it's a racket, right? This is a very parasitic sector, thrives on human suffering, basically. And you have these defense contractors, like Lockheed Martin or Raytheon, and they bring in billions of dollars every year whenever there's a war. And actually, it doesn't matter which side wins. The US alone has spent $14 trillion on war since 2001. In Canada, you have companies like Irving Shipbuilding that have already received contracts that are worth billions of dollars. And defense stocks have risen in Canada by nearly 40% in the last year alone. So what does all of this mean? I think what makes Lenin's analysis of imperialism so powerful is that it puts to one side everything that's unnecessary in politics and lays bare the real fundamental processes that give rise to modern war. And the ultimate conclusion is this. As long as the economy is ruled by capitalist monopolies, as long as the state serves the interests of finance capital, the horrors of war will continue. War is inevitable, under capitalism. And obviously, there's also peace under capitalism. Capitalists don't wage war all of the time. They do it for a certain reason. They do it to make profits. It wouldn't be in their interest to do it forever. But under capitalism, peace can only prepare the conditions for another war, another barbaric imperialist war at some point in the future. And yeah, by explaining the process from its roots, it's possible to see where war comes from, but also how it can be ended. And I think also it's just as important to say it's possible to say what tactics are not possible in ending war. What absolutely won't work is attempts to appeal to the ruling class or to its political representatives to stop the genocide. You can't convince finance capital to stop acting like a finance capitalist any more than you could convince a tiger to go vegetarian. I think war is not simply a bad policy. It's actually built into the DNA of capitalism itself. And this can be seen from the two-faced approach that Mark Carney and the liberals are taking toward Palestine. Because, they're no longer able to hide the truth. So all of the Western governments are now, they're trying to respond to this upsurge of anger. They're trying to appear critical of Israel. So in January, the Canadian government adopted a freeze on issuing permits for weapons to be shipped to Israel. In April, Carney even claimed that Canada had an arms embargo on Israel. And last month, Canada, along with Britain and France, all announced plans to recognize a Palestinian state. Carney put out a statement. He says, "The deepening suffering of civilians leaves no room for delay in coordinated international action to support peace, security, and the dignity of all human life." Well, I think the hypocrisy in these words is absolutely nauseating. To this day, the Canadian arms manufacturers continue to supply the weapons necessary for the Israeli army to continue its genocide. And this was actually exposed in detail in a report that was written recently called "Exposing Canadian Military Exports to Israel." And this was put together by a few different groups, including the Palestinian Youth Movement, World Beyond War, and Independent Jewish Voices, along with a few others. And this is what the report has to say. I think it's very interesting. It says, "The Canadian government appears to have pursued a strategy of rushing through a record-breaking number of arms export permit approvals to Israel prior to publicly committing to pause approving any new ones. This was then quietly undermined by a series of exceptions and loopholes that were only acknowledged when exposed through media investigations or parliamentary scrutiny. This indicates that the government's policy shifts were more symbolic than substantive, aimed at diffusing public criticism while maintaining material support." So yeah, not only did military exports to Israel continue after this so-called freeze, but exports in 2024 exceeded any previous year on record. Israel was actually the fourth largest customer of the Canadian defense industry in 2024. They got nearly $19 million in weapons shipments. So this actually shows you the real nature of the liberals, right? They love to cry crocodile tears about the horrors of war. They call for diplomacy and restraint while actually themselves participating in the worst atrocities. However, I have to say, in the conclusion to their report, the authors call for the government to abide by their obligations under domestic and international law, to stop supporting the genocide, and to impose an arms embargo. I think what the report itself actually says is that the ruling class has no scruples, right? They will say whatever they have to. They will resort to any underhanded maneuvers that they need to keep sending weapons to Israel. And they don't care about their own laws. Right? I don't think we can hold them to this to account this way. The sheer horror and the outrage against the genocide is forcing Western governments to make gestures condemning Israel. But they will never voluntarily cut Israel off. It would actually be a fatal mistake to place our faith in capitalist parties. What is necessary is a class-independent approach. Because, yeah, the capitalists need war in order to maintain this system, but the opposite is just as true. That millions of oppressed people in Canada, the working class, the poor, and the youth have no interest in war. And more than this, the working class is actually the class that produces all of the wealth in society, and this means that they have the special ability to shut society down. There's actually a very good campaign that was launched recently by the Labour for Palestine group. They call it the Hot Cargo Kills campaign, and they're calling on workers to refuse to handle military goods bound for Israel. I think this is the way forward, right? The working class has the power to stop the genocide in practice by depriving the Israeli regime of the resources that they need to carry it out. But also, ultimately, we have to go beyond this. Because to truly put an end to the horrors of war once and for all, we need to get to the root of the problem and smash the system that breeds war. And that means revolution. The working class has to take power into its hands and rebuild society based on need instead of profit, and based on international solidarity. Sometimes I say this a lot. I've talked to people on the street, and sometimes I hear people say, well, yes, I agree with you, but what you are proposing is impossible, right? At least for now. We have to work within the system. So, a lot of people, they call us utopians for raising the idea of revolution. But the reality is this. The only utopian idea is that capitalism can be made to be peaceful, that capitalism can be made to be not bloody or barbaric, right? The great German revolutionary, Rosa Luxemburg, once said, the choice facing humanity is between socialism or barbarism. I think that's never been truer than today. And this actually is not just an abstract possibility or something that has only happened in the distant past. If you want an example of revolution, you need to look no further than the magnificent uprising that is taking place in Indonesia right now. What began as a demonstration against the police killing of a 21-year-old rideshare driver has actually turned into a massive revolutionary movement involving millions of students and poor workers. And this is an inspiration. A movement like this, which shows the real class divisions in society, also shows the way in which society can actually be transformed. So yeah, to end war, we need revolution. It needs to be a revolution led by the working class and by the revolutionary youth. And when this comes, we'll finally be able to put an end to this imperialist nightmare and usher in an epoch of peace between peoples. I'll leave it at that.